For those who are standing, if you could be seated. And if you're standing to leave, if you could be seated and remain with us for this important session. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our exciting side event on scaling blue bonds and unlocking the blue economy for SIDS. At our session today, we are joined by His Excellency, Dr. Dean Jonas, Minister of Social Transformation and the Blue Economy of Antigua and Barbuda, Mr. Carlos Rodriguez, CEO and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. We also have with us Ms. Beverly Wade, Director of the Blue Bonds Project for Finance. We have Mr. Jean Robinson, Project Manager of the SWIFISH of the Ministry of Fisheries and the Blue Economy of Seychelles. We also have Ms. Karen McDonald-Guile, Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and Ms. Simona Marinescu, UN Resident Coordinator for Samoa, Cook Island, Niue, and Tokelau. And I am Tomasi Blair, Team Lead and Lead Negotiator on Sustainable Development for Antigua and Barbuda's Chairmanship of AOSIS. You have heard over and over before that SIDS are large ocean states. But what does this really mean? For one, it means that there are potential for sustainable resource accumulation. But how does blue bonds fit into this equation? First, we must understand what blue bond truly mean. There are various definitions sailing around. From my perspective, I look at it this way. Blue bond is a new sustainable innovative tool that can be identified as a debt instrument that is issued to support investments in healthy oceans and blue economies. Unlike many other countries, SIDS populations almost certainly are living within reach of the shoreline. Because there are 39 SIDS, which are almost entirely reliant on long-term oceanic health, the three regions of AOSIS, the Caribbean, Pacific, and ACE region, presents a particular clear business opportunity for blue bonds. But how do we move beyond the concept and move towards ensuring that SIDS, being the most vulnerable countries, are able to access and gain from blue bonds? We have examples like Seychelles and Belize that have benefited from blue bonds. Within the context of blue bonds and in its relations to access to finance, how would the development of an MBI complement the use of blue bonds? So much to discuss with so little time, so we might as well dive into our discussions today. We will hear from a very dynamic group of presenters, so be sure to listen, take notes, and learn, and report back to your respective governments on the importance of blue bonds. We will now move into today's session with opening remarks by Mr. Carlos Rodriguez, CEO and Chairperson of the Global Environmental Facility. Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chair, and it's a real pleasure to be here today with our colleagues from the SIDS. And I would like to make an initial proposal so we can stop calling ourselves SIDS, Small Island Development States. I don't think they are small, they are large oceanic islands. So we should call the SIDS the boss, big oceanic states. I think that that is relevant in the context of what we should be doing in terms of working and engaging with large oceanic islands. At least this is how we see them at the GEF. Having said that, for us at the GEF, Global Environment Facility, it's extremely important to be able to support not just with finance, but also on innovative approaches on how we can support the mobilization on financial resources. The GEF, by far, is the largest environmental fund responding to 6 or 7 conventions. And even though we allocate around $1.2 billion per year, and in the next cycle that will go north of that, this is just a small percent, is less than 1% of what is invested on an annual basis in nature conservation through all countries. And if we talk about biodiversity conservation, we are the largest provider of financial support to countries. We only mobilize around 0.5% of what it is annually invested in nature conservation. So who are the big providers of finance to nature conservation? Well, every single country. 80% of what annually is invested in nature conservation comes from investment through governments, public expenditures. 80% of that is public expenditures. So 20% is a combination of private sector, finance, multilateral and bilateral. And this is where the GEF is located, multilateral. So 20%. So if all the nations through public and private investments are allocating around $120 billion in nature conservation, and the needs today are $750 billion, how are we going to do to narrow and close that global financial gap? That's the context of what we should be talking today when we talk about blue economy and blue financial mechanisms. Because the GEF can be 3 times, 4 times, 10 times bigger than what we are today, that we won't be able to fully narrow that global financial gap. And yes, ODA must grow, but it has a limit. And we need to be realistic that we need to be really keen on how we mobilize financial resources from all sources. So 2 elements here are key, so we can really understand the overall challenges. One is that since 2010, when we agree on the Aichi targets within the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, all countries committed to do something extremely important and relevant that is extremely useful to narrow down the global financial gap, which is Aichi target number 3, that talks basically on how we should move from negative incentives, perverse incentives, subsidies into positive incentives for nature conservation. And probably Aichi target number 3 was the one that we did the smallest progress in terms of the Aichi targets that ended in 2020. And now there's a new version, proposed version in the new framework of a target number 3. So in the context of mobilizing financial resources, with the aspiration of narrowing the global financial gap, the most relevant element is how do we work at the country level to stop investing in those financial activities that destroy forests, natural ecosystems, coral reefs, and ecosystems, land and oceanic ecosystems. The numbers in terms of forests are very clear. All nations invest 144 times more financial resources in activities that generate deforestation than what they invest in forest conservation. As simple as that. We humans invest many times more resources in activities that destroy nature and contribute to climate change and pollute the environment than what we invest in sustainability, in the SDGs and the environmental conventions. If we are able to align public and private investments with the Paris Agreement, the new CBD framework, the SDGs, the need for financial resources will decrease substantially. And this is where innovative mechanisms like the blue bonds can be a good way to finance our needs at the local level. So 2 things are important. One, the one that I just mentioned, which is, contributing in more policy coherence, whereby all policies will help public and private investment be totally aligned with the Paris Agreement, the CBD frameworks, and our commitment to the Chemicals Convention. That's extremely important. And the other second element that we at the GEF look with a lot of attention is how do we help countries mobilize financial resources more efficiently? Because even though the GEF for the period 2022-2026 will have $5.3 billion. If you divide that into 143 nations, there's not enough resources for all countries. So the Jeff resources should be a catalyzer of a more effective way to mobilize domestic resources. And in order to mobilize more effective domestic resources, we need to do some basic homeworks. One question that we need to ask ourselves is how much are we, all of our nations, investing in nature conservation? And there is not a single nation in this planet that can give us a concrete response to that. Just a handful of nations has done the biodiversity expenditure review. A country can easily tell you how much you invest in schools and hospitals, in defense, but not in nature conservation. And when you do the exercise, the biodiversity expenditure review, you will find that the country is investing much more resources than what you thought in nature conservation. There are many agencies investing in nature conservation that are not aligned and responding to the National Biodiversity Strategy Plan. So when you do the biodiversity expenditure review, you will immediately have an X-ray of who is investing, private and public sector at the country level, in nature conservation, in positive investments. When you have them all identified, you need to begin the political dialogues to align them with the national policies. And the second element is the creation of new innovative financial mechanisms. And here the blue bonds definitely becomes a very attractive mechanism to bring investment. I think that this is extremely important, and I will finalize in a minute by saying a couple of things. One, today, as we hopefully approach the end of this global pandemic, the direct impact of the pandemic is huge on developing nations. Developing nations are going through an economic recession, fiscal deficit, budget cuts, and debt. You need to finance your regular ordinary expenditures, and that can only be done with debt. The debt is becoming a huge issue. If you, on top of this, put extreme weather events happening on a regular basis on most of our nations, this is a terrible combination in terms of having a strong economic baseline for achieving your sustainability goals. I think that blue bonds should take us to something bigger and stronger, and I strongly believe that in order to deal with the debt, the fiscal deficits, and the impacts of extreme weather events, big oceanic states should begin thinking on doing blue structural adjustment plans. And this is something that I strongly believe that multilateral development banks will be extremely interested. Blue structural adjustment plans. These are working with banks in major investments that would, with the ultimate objective of moving strong towards a blue economy, will provide strong funding in ways that you do a structural adjustment by which the economy shifts from these unsustainable, irrational economic systems into a circular blue mechanism. This hasn't been tried anywhere, but I think that if we capture the best of the structural adjustment plans that many of our countries went through in the 1990s in preparing our economies for globalization and free trade, I think that we can have an opportunity to be able to talk of funding at a scale that can help us do the transition. So I thank you so much, Chair, for the opportunity to be here. The Jeff will be doing strategic financing through different initiatives in Jeff 8. We are designing a blue-green island integrated program that addresses in an integrated manner the management of land and ocean resources in most of these big oceanic states. So thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Carlos, and you said a mouthful. It was a lot for us. And some important points that you made were perhaps relevant to the context that we're speaking in for SIDS, in terms of how we access finance, how we become more sustainable as it pertains to debt. And I think the latter part of your presentation is a good segue into where we want to have our discussions this afternoon on how we can find innovative means in addressing debt sustainability for SIDS. And I think the point that you made in us becoming debt sustainable, it will allow us to achieve the goals of the SDGs, the goals of the Paris Agreement, and also the aspirations outlined within the Samoa pathway. So now it's the exciting time that we have all been waiting for. We will have a presentation that is themed the Blue Bonds in Action, followed by the panel discussion. We have a panel that is well-versed for today's discussion with a wealth of experience, speaking in the context of their work in SIDS. We are joined by Mr. John Robinson, Project Manager of Sweetfish, which is a JEF project of Seychelles. John Robinson is the Project Manager of the 3rd Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Governance and Shared Growth Project at the Ministry of Fisheries and the Blue Economy of Seychelles. Jan has coordinated fisheries, research, and management projects in Seychelles and the Indian Ocean for over 25 years, encompassing roles with the Seychelles Fishing Authority and the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. His research has focused on coral reef ecology, reef fish behavior, climate change, and fisheries management. Jan has specific expertise in spawning aggregation fisheries and is a director of science and conservation of fish aggregations, a nonprofit organization based in the US. He has authored over 40 peer-reviewed scientific articles and books. We are also joined by Ms. Beverly Wade. She is the director of the Blue Bonds and Project for Finance Permanence Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister in Belize. She's responsible for the implementation of the Blue Loan and Conservation Funding Agreements and the coordination across government and non-government actors and sectors in the delivery of key marine conservation targets and commitments. Ms. Wade has been involved in fisheries and oceans management for over 27 years, and as the fisheries administrator and the director of the Blue Economy, where she has direct responsibility for the coordination of policy and program implementation. We are also joined by Karen McDonald-Gile, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is a regional umbrella environmental fund that uses a flexible structure to facilitate innovative solutions and consolidate regional conservation impact. With over 25 years of experience in civil society participation, public sector policy development, and project design, Karen is a regional expert in conservation trust fund management. She has served as the CEO of Jamaica's largest environmental grant-making institution, the Environmental Foundation of Jamaica, and has worked regionally with the United States Agency for International Development and the United Nations Environment Program. She is a Jamaican national, and Karen has served on multiple national boards and is also a founding member of the Jamaican Institute of Environmental Professionals. And then we're joined by Ms. Simona Marinescu, who has more than 20 years of experience in the international development and humanitarian affairs, spanning all development contexts, including SIDS. She is currently serving as a UN resident coordinator in Samoa, Cook Island, Niue, and Tuvalu, where she oversees the implementation of the Samoa Pathway and the UN Pacific Strategy. Prior to her current role, she worked with UNDP as director of the Development Impact Group in New York, in charge of program effectiveness, knowledge management, and innovation and South-South cooperation. She was also director of the Istanbul International Center for Private Sector in Development. She's a senior economist. She was a senior economist for Iraq and acting head of the Humanitarian Reconstruction and Development Unit of UNAMI. Before joining UNDP, she worked with the World Bank for the Middle East and North Africa region, USAID, as well as her own country as a member of the government and the Parliament of Romania. So you would see from the panelists, they are well-versed and well-equipped. They have a wealth of experience that they're willing to share with us today. So we will begin with our Blue Bonds in Action presentation, and this will be given by Mr. Jan Robinson of the Seychelles. Jan, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Seychelles, 115 islands spread over 1.4 million square kilometers in the Western Indian Ocean. So small, you can't even see the islands on most maps. So to make up for the short-sightedness of cartographers, we make a lot of noise. One thing that made quite a lot of noise was the Blue Bond. Seychelles in 2018 was the first country to issue a sovereign blue bond. So today, I'll give an overview of that process and what has happened since. Is it showing the presentation? Is the presentation? Sorry, just waiting for the presentation. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the topic today, as I've just described, is the Seychelles Blue Bond. You can see at the bottom there our major partners in this innovative financial transaction that played a key role in allowing us to do this mechanism. So why did Seychelles issue a blue bond? So, like many small island developing states, we have a very important ocean economy, which is fisheries. And fisheries have developed over several decades and had reached the limits, in most cases, of development. And in fact, most fisheries were characterized by issues with access, mainly open access. Overcapacity had emerged, overfishing was happening on several of the key fish stocks. This was impacting on fishers' rights, livelihoods, and well-being. So in looking at how we would transition to sustainable fisheries, we looked at the economics of what that would cost. And the management costs alone were substantial. Plus, there was a need for the country to still allow growth in the fisheries sector, offsetting any short-term costs associated with rebuilding fish stocks. Through activities such as value addition. So this was one of the key imperatives for Seychelles to start looking about how some of these costs were to be financed. There was also happening in parallel a very strong conservation ambition in the country, which was involving another innovative financial transaction of a debt conversion. And through that debt conversion, Seychelles committed to protect 30% of exclusive economic zone, some over 400,000 square kilometers, and to expand sustainable use MPAs. And these sustainable use MPAs were something very new to Seychelles, and clearly there was a need to understand how fisheries would be managed in these sustainable use zones. And that included considering more modern approaches to fisheries management, such as an ecosystem approach, such as the inclusion of harvest strategies in the way that we manage fisheries in these new MPAs created by this debt conversion. The other key rationale was to really not only look at what needed to be done in terms of the public institutional strengthening and the enabling environment, but to allow local communities of fishers, other civil society organizations to play a key role in decision-making, to look at how they could develop community-based solutions, and also to see how the private sector, in the fisheries sector, but also in associated services, could also build more sustainable business approaches, benefiting from what was happening in terms of the conservation and the fisheries ambitions. So how was the transaction and use of proceeds structured? You have to press this every time, sorry. Okay, the Blue Bond was issued, as I said, in 2018 to three investors in the US. This is Nuveen Capital, Calvert Impact Capital Prudential. The government of Seychelles was the issuing body. The credit enhancement features really enabled us to take this to market and have a good market price on this transaction, and to reduce the risk to investors and to the government of Seychelles and our partners. This included an IBRD guarantee of $5 million and a new GEF instrument called the non-grant instrument pilot of $5 million. The bond is paid back over 10 years, with the principal being paid in the last 3 years. The repayment of the bond is on the government of Seychelles. It's not on the beneficiaries of the bond proceeds. And the GEF instrument allows us to bring the coupon rate that we're paying on the bond from 6.5% to 2.8%. And the GEF non-grant instrument pilot itself is paid back over very long periods at very, very low interest rates. So it enabled Seychelles to bring down the cost of this transaction. Through subsidiary agreements, we worked with our intermediary partners, mainly the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust and the Development Bank of Seychelles, to allocate the proceeds of this blue bond transaction through grants and loans to the ultimate beneficiaries. And the allocation of this financing was built around eligibility criteria and fairly robust evaluation processes. As we'll obviously discuss later, the issue of not having blue bond principles or global standards meant that we had to create these ourselves. So how is the project progressing? So far, the grant components of the blue bond proceeds are going extremely well. There's been 5 calls for proposals, some 29 projects focused with a commitment of about $1.13 million. Some examples there of some of the activities we're financing. Loans, we've not yet dispersed loans, mainly due to issues which I'll touch on later. But there are 5 applications going through the process. 8 expressions of interest have also come in, and some examples there of the activities that we are looking to support. And then for the Swire Fish project itself, which provides financing in the form of conventional IBRD financing and the GEF grant, we're at fairly okay rates of disbursement, with many activities complete or ongoing. So what lessons have been learned from this transaction? I think it's quite clear, that as we move a few years down the line from this issuance, that some of the policy and governance processes that were required to unlock the use of proceeds in some cases needed to be more fully aligned. This is things like ensuring that the aquaculture regulations were in place. They took a number of years to finalize after bond issuance, and ensuring that the port development where many of these businesses were, or many of these potential beneficiaries were located, was also completed. There was a need to plan for sufficient redundancy in pipelines. Obviously, you start with a pipeline and some potential investors or businesses drop out, or they move on to other sources of financing. So this has been one issue for us. Land availability and public infrastructure development are a major constraint in a small island state. In Seychelles, our islands are very mountainous, and there is very little coastal land for development. And so the government has had to develop a whole new port for what will be the potential beneficiaries of the loan financing. So this has been a major constraint for Seychelles so far. We've had to adapt the funding schemes to emerging challenges, so that's been vital. So obviously COVID had an impact on the investment climate of the country. We also brought down the personal contribution rate to align with other concessionary finance schemes in the country, and so on. The capacity building needs that you need for a country that had never really had such amounts of grant and loan financing available before should not be underestimated. The capacity building has been critical and remains so. So in terms of is there potential for scaling and replicability, this is an interesting and a very good example of how blended finance can work. There is money available for government, civil society, and businesses investing in this transition to sustainable fisheries through the various ways that the project funds and the use of the bond proceeds are deployed. It was very clear at the outset that investors in the Blue Bond were very interested in Seychelles because of a strong framework and a strong ambition for how the project would work, and the importance of having strong intermediary institutions. There was the need to create country-specific blue eligibility criteria because simply there were no Blue Bond principles at the time of issuance, and we're happy to share our experience of how we did that. The bond size is very small. Compared to other green bonds or blue bonds that have since come along. But for a small island of 100,000 people, it's quite a transformative fund. This was a private placement which reduced the risks, and it was much better for a small bond side. The credit enhancement features I've mentioned, they were essential in reducing cost and risk. The market pricing was of key importance for this transaction. We wanted this to be priced correctly by the markets, and I think that's going to be key for other bond transactions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. We're a bit pressed for time, so we'll move into the next presentation by Ms. Beverly Wade, presenting the Belize Blue Bond. Beverly.
Thank you. Just waiting for the presentation to be loaded.
If we could load the next presentation by Belize.
Thank you. So as introduced by the moderator, we're going to present to you our Blue Bond experience in Belize. We're, I guess you could say, freshly minted. We are approximately a little over 6 months into our Blue Bond, but we are very excited to share with you our experience so far and to contribute to this very important discussion. So why the Blue Bonds for Belize? Well, it allowed us to now embark on a debt conversion, which enabled Belize to repurchase a quarter of the country's total public debt. And it allowed us to do this at a 45% discount through a blue loan arranged with strategic partners like the TNC. It allowed us to now result in a total national debt reduction of 12% of the GDP for Belize. And for a small developing country, that is significant. It also allowed us to look at long-term financing for conservation in Belize. Belize is a country with a very long history of conservation and a long history of sustainable use. And actually, Belize has been one of the global leaders when it comes to reaching global targets in conservation. To date, we have 20% of our ocean space already under conservation. But key to us was how do we ensure that the conservation is effective, and how do we ensure that these ambitious targets that the government of Belize has had for our natural resources are really financed properly, and that we're in a position to allow for finance permanence for these ambitions and targets. And of course, the Blue Bond allowed us to set forward a very ambitious program for future conservation action by the country, and a program which ensures that we are excellent stewards of those resources that our country's national economy depends on, and the livelihoods of our people. So the process really started with negotiations between the government of Belize and TNC in 2020. And that led to discussions with Credit Suisse, which is a private sector investor into our Blue Bond, and the DFC, which is the US Developed Finance Corporation, which played a critical role in the entire deal. It provided the credit enhancement through de-risking the Blue Bond deal, and it really it set the stage for the kind of credibility to the deal for the private sector, who were then comforted to now buy into the Blue Bonds scheme. And the transaction closed early November 2021. So as mentioned before, the TNC, who was one of the experienced intermediators, they had experience from Seychelles. I recall the Seychelles last slide of whether or not it is scalable. Belize have shown that it is scalable, because we have now negotiated through this deal the single largest Blue Bond globally. And so TNC created the Blue Investment Company, and they then, along with the government of Belize, started to engage with the DFC and Credit Suisse, who then were able to create the enabling environment, as I said, for inflows from Credit Suisse through bond market investors into the BIC, who then created an impact note to the government of Belize so that it was able to pay off the original bondholders at a haircut of 45%, and then allowed the government of Belize to now set up a more flexible repayment scheme back to the BIC for repayment back to those investors who had invested into the deal, and to also allow the government of Belize to now invest in marine conservation. So how is our Blue Bond deal structured? It really has two main components. The first component is the Blue Loan and the Blue Bond. And as mentioned earlier, that's where equity was provided through the BBIC, where it received financing from Credit Suisse and from the Blue investors. That funding was provided to the government of Belize through an impact note, who then paid off its original bondholders. The government of Belize now, through a new agreement, now pays back to the BBIC, who then pays back Credit Suisse, who then pays back the Blue Bond investors. But one of the innovative parts of this Blue Bond deal is that it has, along with it, a conservation funding agreement. And that conservation funding agreement is where Belize is now able to, in a very innovative and creative manner, to now move their ambitions for marine conservation, sustainable use, and responsible blue economic development, where from the savings, the government of Belize is in a position to now create an endowment fund for finance permanence, for marine conservation and its other ambitions. And that endowment fund is expected to, after 20 years, be available for long-term marine conservation to the tune of $100 million US. Furthermore, there are annual inflows into a conservation fund from the government of Belize of approximately $4 million annually for on-the-ground partners and the government to be doing the operational work to ensure effective conservation. Challenges and responses. Well, as mentioned before, COVID and the government of Belize saw itself, because of COVID and its debt, the level of debt, in a very tight fiscal position. Belize Tourism, which is our #1 revenue earner, saw a contraction of about 16.7% in 2020, and the debt was equal to approximately 133% of our GDP. And Belize was at the point where we were about to negotiate to defer payments to our debt holders at that time. And so that is when Belize decided to approach our debt holders and then to now negotiate with TNC to look at a restructuring for debt. Furthermore, our national economy was highly exposed to economic slowdown, and it reduced government revenues resulting from hurricane and large storms. And therefore, one of the other key aspects of this agreement and innovations is that it has built into it parametric insurance policy to provide coverage for the blue loan debt payment in the event that we would have been subjected to storms or other shocks. The success, impacts, and recommendations. Well, as mentioned earlier, we were able to significantly reduce our national debt. We realized approximately 185 million debt stock reduction in Belize from a total debt of $553 million. We had significant reduction in debt services because of the reduction in debt payments that were realized through this, and also because of the discount that we were able to negotiate with our bondholders. We've also realized finance permanence through this deal with an endowment fund that would be available to marine conservation and responsible development. We will realize improved management, healthier oceans, and sustainable economic opportunities through the various conservation commitments and through the various instruments, such as a comprehensive marine spatial plan that is now going to be funded through this deal to ensure that Belize has a platform which speaks to the stewardship of our blue resources, but also to the development of a responsible blue economic pathway that will ensure that we continue to have the gains from the potentials from our blue space. And finally, we would have a tested model for conservation funding and mechanism by new initiatives. And Belize is already now looking at a project for finance permanence initiative that is meant to leverage what we have done with the blue bond, and it's meant to build on what we have done with the blue bond. And of course, we've created a very credible space for future private sector investment with ambitions. We're now saying to the private sector, yes, you can invest, and you can invest with ambitions. In terms of whether or not it is scalable, Belize is proven, we've proven that it is scalable, highly scalable. We went from a very small blue bond to now a very large blue bond. And there are three things that we thought should be considered when looking at scalability. One of it is commitment. The political will has to be there, that countries should be committed to achieving the conservation outcomes. Second thing is the availability and affordability of credit enhancement. Key, the deal would not have happened without the credit enhancement provided through the DFC. And finally, sorry. And finally, the availability of debt refinance is also one of the other key considerations. So we're very new in terms of implementation. Implementation has been going well. Since November of last year, Belize have already delivered on 2 key milestones where we've increased and expanded our protected areas, and we have also now converted all national lands within our Belize Barrier Reef system, a World Heritage Site, as mangrove reserves. And we have been making our payments to the BIC to pay back our bondholders and to have operational our National Conservation Trust Fund, which will be available to stakeholders and organizations on the ground and the government of Belize the 1st of January 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly, and also to you, Jan, for 2 quite interesting presentations. And I think there's a lot for us to learn, as said, in how you've utilized blue bonds. While there's some differences in your application, it's both are quite a success story. And we'll have an opportunity to come back with a Q&A session to press you on some of the issues that you've encountered with your application of the blue bonds. And so now we will go into our panel discussion, and we will go first by hearing from Ms. Karen McDonald, who is Karen McDonald-Guile, who is the CEO of the Caribbean Diversity Fund. And so, Karen, if I may call you Karen, it would be interesting to learn more about the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund's current experience with blue bonds. And are there any pros and cons relative to other financial tools that the fund currently employs in the Caribbean region?
Thank you very much. First, thank you for everybody for including me in the panel and welcoming me here today. In terms of the conservation trust funds, it's a very good segue from Beverly's presentation to mine. The use of conservation trust funds globally has been increasing and improving. They really did start from the original debt for nature type swaps, and we've grown since then in the 1990s to the position we're in now of really playing a pivotal role in liaising and supporting and facilitating conservation financing. I usually use the term to allow those who are implementers to do the implementation and to play that ambassadorial role in how we support the governments and the implementers of programs on the ground in the various countries to do their work. So as an example, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is a regional-based fund. We were set up through an endowment, as Beverly has well explained, but our endowment was through the government of Germany for conservation trust funds in 12 countries throughout the Caribbean region. So far, 10 countries now have partnership agreements with us, which means that they are regularly receiving funding from the endowment to each of their national conservation trust funds. And those national conservation trust funds have met a set of criteria to continue and do work very similar to what was described for the blue bonds in terms of program activities on the ground in the various countries. And the idea for both the CBF at the regional level and the national funds at the local level is that there are these mechanisms already in place to accept, provide sinks, provide resources, provide technical assistance to innovative systems such as blue bonds, and of course other types of innovations. Discussions have been on blue carbon facilities and other type of finance mechanisms that we will be working with. And just to acknowledge that we will start next year with a blue finance specific program that will be funded by the GEF. So I acknowledge to Carlos Manuel and the team the support that they will be giving us for the Caribbean Bluefin program, because the idea is to make sure that we create mechanisms that work for the region that we are operating in, and that they are specific to the needs of the Caribbean, and consider the various factors while considering and learning from the opportunities that you would have heard from both the Seychelles and Belize. So we're very, very interested in figuring out the best way for continuing that progress of blue bonds in the region. We're excited that one of our Caribbean partners in Belize has started the program. They also have very strong national conservation trust funds, as you heard, and we look forward to that continued type of relationship. The only other thing I would add very quickly is the concept of windows of opportunity for grant making also exist at the regional and national level through the conservation trust funds. And just as an example, we also have programs working on climate change in terms of ecosystem-based adaptation, and also in terms of circular economy. So the Conservation Trust Fund idea and concept is one that we hope will continue to grow and continue to be used for the role we can play in facilitating some of these exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and hopefully time permitting, we'll have another round of questions coming back to you. But to you, Simona, given the intervention you just heard by Karen and the experiences both from Belize and Seychelles, what are your views on the practicality of blue bonds, especially as it pertains to the region that you're representing, the PSEDs, and perhaps your insight on how blue bonds could be practically used for debt sustainability? We've heard the experience from Belize, and this could probably just be an experience from one country in itself, but whether or not you have a feeling that this could be adapted throughout all sets. And then maybe in context of blue bonds, would the MVI assist in actually realizing the fruitfulness of the blue bonds?
Thank you so much, moderator, honorable Minister Jonas, excellencies, representatives of the government, distinguished panelists. I'm very pleased to join you today and to represent the Pacific, the United Nations in the Pacific. The Pacific has not started yet embarking on such innovative financing instruments. I guess we wanted to learn first from the Caribbean and make sure, and from Seychelles, and make sure we do not repeat the mistakes. But let me just say that there is great progress across the region into committing towards the 30 by 30 marine protection goal, and also ensuring that budgets are better aligned with the targets of the SDGs pertaining to life on land and life under the water. Indeed, a very stressed debt indebtedness environment, to which I hope the index will bring great support. Let me mention that the Asian Development Bank took an interesting step forward for the Pacific and established a blue bond incubator to help countries understand and prepare for that particular step forward. And in that regard, I commend Fiji for being the first country to request support through the incubator. But I just want to mention that while this is still a debt instrument, it is extremely important in ensuring that countries address resilience early on and avoid bearing a huge GDP cost every time there is a disaster. So if we compare the two, I think it is much better that countries embark in taking risk towards more innovative financing and build as much as possible a resilience with whatever instruments exist. However, while we support and advocate innovative financing, I need to mention that this does not take away our resolve to fix a broken global financing system. A financing system that is immoral and discriminating against low and mid-income countries. And that's where the multidimensional vulnerability comes in. And to make a connection between the index and the very interesting financing instruments presented here, very interesting financing engineering. I would just mention that the index will complement the GNI per capita. It is meant to ensure that it brings clarity that at the same level of impact per capita, income per capita, countries are different in terms of needs ahead. So the GNI per capita has never identified the needs. And that the MVI itself will help seeds build credit worthiness so that they could much easier engage into adopting this kind of instruments. So what the MVI wants to do is to ensure that the bulk of that seeds primarily, but again, the index is going to be universal, is being restructured and serviced at an affordable cost. So we expect the MVI to be used by the international financial institutions in providing support for that restructuring and that servicing, in, as I mentioned several times, in decoupling allocations of SDRs from the quota, in ensuring that SDRs flow through regional banks, through regional funds, through more SDR holders so that they can develop more innovative instruments, and that ultimately there is a definition of vulnerability because most of the instruments that are meant to support that servicing in a stressed debt environment speak about vulnerable states without a clear definition as to what that means. So the MVI is particularly important in that regard. So as it serves restructuring the debt, it will also build credit worthiness. And another important way in which the MVI, we hope, will be used is to resolve this parametric insurance thing that becomes extremely difficult for countries to come up with clauses, hurricanes, cyclones, cyclone clauses for the Pacific when a debt suspension is being granted so that countries can fund their recovery and offset the losses that they experience through disasters and shocks, and then resume repaying the debt when that is possible. So there are multiple ways in which the MVI will help. I need to say that the MVI will support all the actors involved to better understand the risks. The risks will be mapped, will be clear, will build, again, confidence that that's clarity with respect to what the challenges are along the way, and again, better support countries to do better planning and overall to service that in a better manner. And we look forward to learning more from those who have already embarked on this innovative financing mechanism. But seeds need traditional development assistance as well. So the traditional development assistance can very well operate as an enabler for more private financing. That's where we want to get. Today, disbursing ODA for the seeds is almost 5 times more expensive than in other parts of the world, something that has never been considered when ODA allocations are made to small island developing states, let alone that most of them are mid-income and upper income and no longer qualify to most of the traditional development assistance. So that's an important element that the MVI is meant to support, to identify the cost, the risks, the cost, the unit cost, and allow a fairer allocation of the existing resources before embarking on concessional financing and on other financing instruments. So we very much hope that the MVI will be adopted. This year, we'll look at the room here, and we just want to inform that the index is not for seeds alone. The index is meant to complement the GNI per capita as a universal parameter metric to allow countries to have access to development cooperation beyond graduation if vulnerabilities still remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. I know you're particularly passionate about the MVI, so this is why I really wanted you to come in here. But you also mentioned in your response about parametric insurance policies, and I know that that this is an area where Belize can speak more on, and perhaps whether or not, from Beverly's perspective, whether or not the parametric insurance policy can cover additional shocks, those related to economic shocks, such as we have experienced during the pandemic.
Yes, definitely. We believe that there's scope for this. And it depends very much on the negotiation with the provider, really. For example, when we negotiated the Belize's Blue Bond, we looked at a rainfall modifier. You know, that was included, allowing for smaller storms with very high rainfall to also trigger cover. So it depends on the negotiation that occurs with that provider. Also in the region in Belize, outside of the Blue Bond, we are looking at parametric insurance for fisheries. The coast parametric insurance that's being done with the World Bank and the CCRIF in the Caribbean is now looking at providing parametric insurance for fisheries. And of course, as I said, the importance is really in the negotiation and the parameters that are set. In Belize, in the Mesoamerican Reef area, we're also looking at parametric insurance for our reef systems. That's geared at allowing countries like Belize that the coral reef plays such a central role in its economy and also for livelihoods, to ensure that when a storm hits, that we would now have money for rapid response for recovery at the end of the day. So parametric insurance is very much evolving, and I've given 3 examples of how we're looking at it in Belize. So the options are there, and we do believe that there's definitely scope for this.
Yeah, good to hear that parametric insurance is scalable and can be expanded beyond environmental factors. So Jan, I know that we're a bit pressed for time, so I'll shoot one over to you. In terms of blue bonds and its legitimacy, its universal legitimacy, do you think that we can achieve some sort of international agreement or some principles relating to blue bonds?
Yeah, I would say, of course we can achieve principles. I think there's efforts have been made towards that in recent years. I think now, certainly at this Oceans Conference, there's much more of a concerted mobilization of institutions and resources to work at principles, noting announcements made as well by the Asian Development Bank on this. And of course, it's possible, but I think what's very clear is that with the ocean space and ocean governance challenges out there, as much as possible, they need to learn from existing principles that apply to sectors such as fisheries, and not reinvent the wheel. And I hope that is the case. I think with Seychelles, I mean, we didn't benefit from having principles at the time of issuance, so we had to come up with elements of principles that may have applied to in a green bond transaction, plus looking at the sectors that we were working at, such as fisheries, such as conservation, and start to incorporate some of those in our own scheme, if you like, or criteria for eligibility. But yes, of course, it can be done.
Thanks, Jan. So it simply means that Seychelles started the process, and so we.
I wouldn't say we started the process. No, I think we did what we had to do to come up with a coherent framework, if you like, of eligibility and principle to make our transaction blue. But I wouldn't say we started for a global set of principles, but certainly lessons could be learned from what we did.
So I look at starting the process in terms of lessons learned and sharing your experiences, right? So I think you should recognize the fact that you started that process. I know that we are almost out for time. I know that my dear friend Simona have one pressing point to make that she'll make in 10 seconds, and then I'll hand it over to my minister, who will give our closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I will be very, very short. So first of all, I wanted to mention that the Pacific wants to make a clear distinction within the concept of blue economy, between conservation and business growth, as this is essential in terms of deciding how the money should flow. But in terms of principles, we know that the International Capital Market Association principles for green bonds are most likely applied right now. What we want to suggest is that these principles to also include an obligation for all the private sector, all the corporate partners to associate their business with distinct corporate social responsibility investments in conservation. That needs to be a requirement that would ensure that while making profits and also supporting the country to service part of its debt, there will be social and environmental goods being created. So CSR as a requirement should be included among the principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. Minister Jonas, if you could offer closing remarks, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation today, enhancing the support for the sustainable blue economy and scaling innovative, transformative, and durable investment in SIDS. And I would like to add that, BOSS is probably the better term, big ocean state. I thank everyone. Today, we were presented with information outlining the remarkable efforts and commendable work carried out by the Blue Bonds in Action in both the Seychelles and Belize, and the support given by the Alliance of Small Island States, Ambassador Webson and his team, and also the Global Environment Facility, GEF, from Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, in creating and granting these investment opportunities in the blue economy. We have delivered a clear message that the blue economy is worth investing in for the future development and success of this important emerging sector, and it has tremendous potential. The focus on growing the blue economy in a sustainable way is our main priority, and through the use of blue bonds and the multidimensional vulnerability index, this goal can be accomplished with the right framework and strategies. Financing the blue economy provides opportunities to encourage sustainable opportunities and in ocean resources for our economic growth and livelihoods in the big ocean states. As small island developing states in the Caribbean region, the portfolio of the Ministry of Social Transformation, Human Resource Development in Antigua and Barbuda was expanded to include the blue economy, which is widely recognized as a major global growth area. This has created a lot of synergies for us in Antigua and Barbuda, because within social transformation, we have gender affairs, which take care of gender, but mainly women and the growth and development of women. We also have within social transformation the youth department, Department of Youth Affairs, that look about youth entrepreneurship. And we also have the department that deals with persons who are differently abled, persons with disabilities. And we have been trying to create opportunities in blue economy related areas for persons with, that are differently abled. This is very important for us. Over 40 million full-time jobs have been created in the blue economy sector globally, in energy, wind energy, offshore, marine aquaculture, fish processing, product, and many, many areas. And we're looking to expand that. So it is very, very good to see major organizations such as the World Bank, UNEP, the Global Environmental Fund, the Commonwealth of Nations, the OECS, are focusing on this sector for growth. So given the vast ocean space available to our small islands in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, we are advantageously positioned to pioneer research in the blue economy and development in these regions. And this is why we are in Antigua and Barbuda pioneering the establishment of the Center of Excellence for Blue Economy and Ocean-Related Studies at the University of the West Indies, which is our premier educational institution in the Caribbean. And we're looking to study, enhance our capacity in not only ocean science, but in finance, economics, and law relating to oceans and the blue economy. So it is important that all governments, global governments, and organizations start to allocate funds and resources towards the global and healthy blue economy so that we can begin to transition towards a blue economy. And this is going to be very demanding, so this is why we have to prioritize it. And all of this information that we got today basically indicates that. So I emphasize that developing a blue economy is feasible, it is good for us, it is good for women, it is good for youth, and it is good for differently abled persons. Solutions exist, and we just have to collaborate and make this a win-win for everyone. I want to thank everyone again, Thank you for your participation, and to all our attendees. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to the panelists and the presenters. This was a truly enriching side event that we had. We were pressed for time, but I guarantee you that we will continue part 2 of this discussion, since there is so much to learn in the blue economy, but also on the usefulness of blue bonds. Thank you again for your engagement, and you will hear from us shortly.